September 1943. Italy had just surrendered, Mussolini was overthrown, and the world seemed upside down. In the chaos, Italian female auxiliaries, nurses, clerks, volunteers were captured by advancing Allied forces. They expected humiliation chains and endless suffering. Propaganda had warned them that Americans were brutal, godless barbarians who would strip them of all dignity. As the train carrying them rattled through the endless farmlands of the American Midwest, fear gnawed at every breath. Some clutched rosaries, murmuring prayers. Others pressed trembling fingers to the windows, convinced they were being carried to some unknown torment. They braced for shouting guards, snarling dogs, and cold cells. Then something unexpected. The first thing that greeted them wasn't cruelty, but scent. The unmistakable aroma of warm bread and coffee drifted through the air. It was a smell most had not known for years, since rationing had stripped Italian households to thin soups and stale crusts. The train screeched to a halt. The doors opened. American guards stood waiting, not screaming, not striking, but calmly gesturing them forward. Past the gates stood wooden barracks lined in perfect rows, with chimneys sending up faint curls of smoke. Inside, folded blankets and bars of soap awaited them. One Italian nurse, no older than 20, whispered in disbelief, "This cannot be real. It must be a trap." They had prepared for chains. Instead, they were met with mercy. The voyage that brought them to America had already drained their courage. In late 1943, after Italy's surrender, groups of Italian female auxiliaries, nurses, clerks, cooks, and volunteers were gathered in North Africa under Allied guard. The desert sun still scorched their uniforms as they were marched aboard transport ships bound across the Atlantic. The women boarded in silence, their minds heavy with propaganda that had long warned them capture meant disgrace, and in the hands of Americans there would be no mercy. The Liberty ship groaned as it left the port of Oran. Below deck, the women were crowded into compartments with simple bunks. Seasickness came quickly. The Atlantic was rough that season, storms hammering the convoy waves, slamming against steel. Some vomited into buckets. Others clutched at each other in darkness, whispering prayers to saints they feared had abandoned them. Rumors circulated in those cramped holds that the Americans might throw them overboard once far enough from shore, that they would be displayed in cages in New York, that they would be sent to work until they collapsed. Fear grew with every swell of the sea. Days blurred into weeks. The hum of engines, the endless horizon, the salt air, they all mixed into a grey monotony. A few ventured onto deck under guard and were stunned to see not cages or cruelty, but sailors playing cards, laughing and smoking cigarettes. The Americans barely looked at them. It was as though they were cargo, not enemies. That indifference unsettled them even more. Finally, the convoy reached the eastern coast of the United States. The women expected jeering mobs, crowds throwing stones at them. Instead, the docks were strangely quiet. Only military police waited, clipboard in hand. The prisoners were marched down gangplanks, processed with brisk efficiency, and loaded onto waiting trains. The journey inland was surreal. Pressed against windows, the women stared at landscapes. They had never imagined vast forests, neat towns, barns, painted bright red children chasing after the train and waving. Some waved back before catching themselves ashamed. Could these really be the monstrous Americans Mussolini had warned them of? Everything looked so ordered, so alive. The train finally stopped. Outside stood rows of trucks, soldiers with rifles slung casually over their shoulders. The prisoners braced themselves, waiting for blows, for shouted insults. None came. They were guided firmly but without cruelty through gates topped with barbed wire. Guard towers rose high above, just as in their nightmares. For a moment their stomachs dropped. This was it, the prison camp, but then their eyes adjusted. Inside the fence, wooden barracks stretched in clean rows, each with windows, chimneys and steps swept free of snow. Laundry lines fluttered with drying clothes. A group of German POWs captured earlier walked past carrying tools. They looked healthy, even cheerful, nodding at the newcomers. The women were assigned to their own barracks. Inside they found bunks stacked neatly with folded blankets. The air smelled faintly of soap and wood smoke. There was a stove at the center radiating heat. On a small table lay rows of bars of soap and tin cups. For women who had spent months sleeping in filth wrapped in lice-infested rags, it felt unreal. One young clerk from Naples touched the blanket with trembling fingers. She whispered, "This is cleaner than my bed at home." Tears filled her eyes, not of joy but of confusion and guilt. Evening came, and with it the greatest shock yet. They were marched to the mess hall. Expecting watery soup, perhaps a crust of bread, they instead received trays heavy with beef stew, mashed potatoes, green beans, and soft rolls glistening with butter. Cups of steaming coffee were placed beside them. The smell filled the room, overpowering the women's resolve. They hesitated. Some pushed their trays away, muttering that it was a trap, that photographs would be taken showing them eating greedily to shame Italy. But hunger gnawed too fiercely. One by one, spoons, lifted lips parted, and food was devoured. The warmth of the stew spread through their bodies, shocking in its richness. An American guard, barely older than the prisoners themselves, passed by, and quietly refilled their cups with more coffee. No sneer, no insult, just a polite nod. Back in the barracks that night, the silence was heavy. No one spoke. For the first time in years, they lay in clean sheets, bellies full, surrounded by order and warmth. The wind rattled the windows, but inside there was only stillness. Some wept quietly, unable to reconcile the reality with the horrors they had been told. The next morning brought further surprises. Roll call was brisk, names checked from a list guard speaking in calm voices. Breakfast followed oatmeal with sugar, toast with jam. The women exchanged glances, astonished. In Italy, even officers' families struggled to find jam, sugar, or meat. Here, even prisoners were fed like honored guests. Whispers spread quickly through the camp. Why are they doing this? What do they want from us? Some remained defiant, convinced it was a scheme to break their loyalty. Others secretly admitted what they could not deny: this treatment was unlike anything they had imagined. The arrival shock had set in. They were not beaten, not starved, not humiliated. Instead, they were clothed, fed, and treated with a dignity that unsettled them more deeply than cruelty ever could. Life inside the camp quickly developed a rhythm, one that was both strangely comforting and deeply unsettling for the Italian women. Each day began with the sharp call of a bugle. Guards entered the barracks, clipboards in hand, and the women lined up outside for roll call. The chill of the early morning air cut through their thin uniforms, yet the routine was orderly. Names were checked, heads counted, and within minutes the process was done. No shouting, no slaps, no endless hours of standing as punishment. Breakfast followed immediately. Some mornings it was oatmeal sprinkled with sugar, others brought scrambled eggs, toast, or pancakes. To women who had grown up with rationing, whose families back home in Italy now survived on watery soups or black market bread, it felt surreal. They sat at long wooden tables, eating in silence, unsure whether to trust what was happening. After breakfast came work assignments. Some were tasked with cleaning the barracks, scrubbing floors, or tending to laundry. Others, trained in nursing or clerical work, were sent to the infirmary or to help with camp records. On occasion, groups were marched outside the wire to nearby farms where they picked vegetables, mended fences, or worked in fields under watchful but relaxed guard. The Americans insisted on hygiene. Showers were available with soap provided regularly. Each prisoner had access to laundry services. Lice, which had plagued them in Italy and North Africa, all but disappeared. The women looked at their reflections in small mirrors and were startled to see their faces returning to health, skin no longer grey with malnutrition, hair no longer brittle with dirt. The guards themselves were another shock. They enforced rules, yes, but with an air of professionalism, not cruelty. A violation talking back, refusing work, breaking curfew was met with loss of privileges or confinement, not beatings. They were treated as soldiers who had lost a war, not as criminals. That distinction weighed heavily on the prisoners. As weeks turned into months, camp life began to feel strangely normal. The barracks echoed with conversations in Italian bursts of laughter, even songs sung softly at night. The women organized themselves, sweeping floors, hanging curtains from scraps of cloth, creating tiny pockets of familiarity in the foreign compound. Yet guilt was a constant companion. Letters arrived through the Red Cross bringing news of home. Cities lay in ruins. Families begged for food. Children in Naples scoured garbage for scraps. And here, behind barbed wire, the women had 3 meals a day, warm beds, soap, even occasional treats like fruit or chocolate. At night, as they lay under clean blankets, whispers spread in the dark. One woman confessed she dreamed of her mother's hollow face staring at her across the dinner table in Italy while she herself was full from American bread. Another wondered aloud whether God would forgive them for living better in captivity than their families did in freedom. The contrast tore at them. Inside the wire there was order, structure, and nourishment. Outside, famine, chaos, and fear. Which was truly the prison? Suspicion lingered. Many still believed it was a trap. They want to make us soft, one woman warned. They will use us against Italy. If we laugh, if we eat, we betray our homeland. But others quietly admitted the truth. Nothing about this resembled the hell they had been promised. The mess hall became a symbol of that contradiction. Each meal carried both comfort and guilt. Coffee warmed their bodies, but every sip reminded them that their families were cold and hungry. A roll of bread satisfied their stomachs but hollowed their hearts. The Americans maintained discipline with an almost unnerving calm. Guards walked the perimeter, rifles slung loosely, chatting casually with one another. Some even smiled or tipped their caps. To the Italian women, this civility was more disarming than hostility could ever have been. One afternoon, while working in the infirmary, an Italian nurse assisted an American medic in bandaging a wounded German prisoner. She was stunned by how carefully the American treated his enemy. Gentle hands, clean dressings, respectful tone. That night she confided in her bunkmate, "If they treat even the Germans like this, then what of us?" Slowly the camp became not just a place of survival, but a place of questions. Every act of kindness, every meal, every polite gesture chipped away at the stories they had been told. Yet no one dared to speak of it openly. To admit that life here was bearable, even better than at home, felt like treason. And so the women carried their confusion, silently trapped not by the barbed wire but by the turmoil within their own hearts. Inside the fences, life was orderly, clean, and full of food. Outside, their homeland starved. And that unbearable contrast was the true torment of captivity. The mess hall had always been a place of routine, rows of tables, the clatter of trays, the steam rising from vats of stew. But one morning, as the Italian women filed inside, something stopped them cold. The air was heavy, with a smell so powerful it seemed to reach straight into their memories: bacon. The salty, smoky scent clung to the rafters, mingling with the rich bitterness of coffee and the sweetness of butter melting on toast. For women who had endured years of rationing, who had seen families back home survive on chestnuts, thin soups, and scraps of bread, the smell was almost unbearable. They stood in line, their hands trembling as trays were filled, strips of sizzling bacon, scrambled eggs, mugs of coffee that steamed in the cold morning air. One prisoner, a young nurse from Florence, froze. The bacon glistened on her plate, curling at the edges, fat still crackling from the pan. She hadn't seen meat like this since childhood. In an instant, she was back in her mother's kitchen Sunday mornings before church, the radio playing softly while her father folded the newspaper. For a moment, the war disappeared. But then came the guilt. Her family was starving. Naples and Rome had been bombed, streets filled with rubble, markets empty. What right did she have to eat this while her mother might be begging for bread? To taste such luxury here in the land of the enemy felt like betrayal. She gripped her fork but could not raise it. Around her the same struggle played out. Some women lowered their heads in silent prayers, trying to resist temptation. Others pushed trays away, convinced it was a trap that Americans would take photographs of them eating greedily to use as propaganda. But hunger was stronger than fear. One woman finally lifted a strip of bacon to her mouth. The moment the flavor touched, her tongue tears rolled down her cheeks. She bent over her tray, weeping as she chewed. Soon others followed, breaking under the weight of longing and hunger. The mess hall filled not with conversation but with the muffled sound of women crying into their meals. The guards said nothing. To them this was simply breakfast. To the prisoners it was an assault more devastating than chains. From that day forward, food was never just food. It became a battlefield of the soul. Bread rolls reminded them of kitchens back home. Chocolate issued on rare afternoons melted too sweetly, reminding them of festivals long past. Peanut butter, strange and sticky, was passed around curiously, its foreign taste sparking laughter even as it deepened their unease. Ice cream handed out on a sweltering summer day felt like a dream they weren't meant to have. Each bite carried weight. To accept this nourishment felt like surrender, like admitting that the enemy was not a monster but human, even generous. Yet to refuse was to starve, to deny themselves survival in the name of loyalty to a homeland that had already collapsed. In the barracks, whispers turned into fierce debates. One woman spat bitterly, "This is their weapon. Not bullets, not bombs, mercy. Mercy that shames us." Another replied quietly, "And yet without it we would die." The paradox gnawed at them day after day. Every meal chipped away at the certainties fascist propaganda had once provided. If Americans were supposed to be cruel, then why were they feeding prisoners better than Italian civilians at home? If this was the enemy's idea of war, what else had Mussolini lied about? The climax was not a dramatic uprising, but a quiet unraveling. With every slice of bread, every refill of coffee, every strip of bacon that recalled childhood mornings, the foundation of their beliefs cracked a little more. They had braced themselves for chains. Instead, they were disarmed with kindness. And for many, that kindness was harder to resist than any weapon of war. Time inside the camp was measured not by calendars but by meals, by seasons, by the changing guards at the towers. Weeks bled into months, and slowly the Italian women found themselves confronting a far greater battle than the one they had left behind, the battle inside their own minds. At first, most clung desperately to the slogans drilled into them during Mussolini's reign. America is decadent, America is cruel, America is soulless. These mantras whispered through the barracks like prayers. But each day of captivity brought new contradictions that chipped away at those words. The first fracture came with language. The camp offered voluntary English lessons, simple classes, run by American chaplains, or even German POW teachers who had picked up the language. At first, the Italian women refused, declaring it unpatriotic to learn the enemy's tongue. But curiosity crept in. Soon, halting phrases floated through the compound, "Good morning, please, thank you." They laughed at each other's mistakes, repeating the strange sounds until they began to stick. Then came books. The camp library held not only Italian classics sent by the Red Cross, but also American novels, magazines, and newspapers. Illustrated magazines showed families smiling on wide suburban lawns, women driving cars, children holding ice cream cones. One prisoner turned a page and stared in disbelief at a picture of an American supermarket aisles overflowing with food, more abundance than Italy had seen in decades. "It cannot be real," she whispered, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Music drifted across the camp in the evenings. Radios played swing tunes, crooners, singing of love and freedom. The rhythm was infectious. One night a group of women tapped their feet to the beat, then quickly stopped ashamed at the pleasure. But the music kept returning, irresistible, gnawing at the wall of propaganda that said Americans were cultureless, brutish. The most devastating blow, however, was not in books or music, it was in money. In early 1944, the Italians learned that prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention could be compensated for their labor. To their shock, the Americans extended this to them as well. The women were offered work assignments, cleaning kitchen duty, sewing uniforms, nursing in the infirmary, even helping in nearby fields. For every hour worked, they were credited a small wage, often in the form of camp scrip paper currency that could be exchanged at the canteen. The reaction was explosive. Some refused outright. "We are not servants, we will not be bought," they cried, insisting that to accept pay from the enemy was betrayal. Others argued the opposite, "We work anyway. Why not accept what is offered?" The first time wages were distributed, silence fell over the barracks. Women stared at the crisp notes in their hands as though the paper itself burned. To be paid not as slaves but as workers with dignity that contradicted everything they had been taught. At the camp, canteen choices awaited them: soap, toothpaste, writing paper, stamps, even small luxuries like chocolate bars, Coca-Cola or cigarettes. The women stood in line hesitant, and then one by one surrendered their tokens in exchange for goods. The first time an Italian prisoner unwrapped a Hershey bar she had purchased herself, she laughed nervously, then burst into tears. "I bought this," she whispered, "with money the enemy gave me." That moment spread like wildfire. The women began to realize they were not only being fed but entrusted with choice, with agency. They could decide how to spend, what to save, whether to buy a luxury or something practical. And with every purchase, the fascist propaganda that had declared Americans to be savage conquerors seemed more absurd. In the evenings, barracks filled with debates. Some argued that the wages were merely another weapon. "They want to turn us," one woman hissed. "They want us to forget Italy." Others shook their heads. "Maybe they treat us this way because this is simply who they are." The questions grew sharper, more dangerous. If this was a lie, what else had been a lie? Letters from home only deepened the conflict. Families in Italy wrote of hunger, of endless queues for bread, of bombed cities and vanished friends. The prisoners read those words while sitting on bunks with candy wrappers, with full bellies, with hands washed clean by soap they had bought with their own earnings. Shame burned their hearts, yet so did relief. The psychological collapse was not sudden. It was slow, relentless, like a tide washing away a shoreline. The women began humming swing tunes while scrubbing laundry. They began practicing English phrases with guards who corrected them gently. They passed around magazines, marveling at photographs of American life. By the summer of 1944, some even confessed quietly, only to their closest friends, that they dreaded the thought of leaving. Not because they wished to abandon Italy, but because captivity here had become safer, kinder, and more ordered than freedom back home. And so ideology crumbled. Fascism had promised them honor through sacrifice, dignity through war, and glory through obedience. Yet here in the very heart of the enemy's land, dignity was restored not by Mussolini's words, but by an American guard politely refilling a coffee cup. They had not been broken by force. They had been undone by kindness. By 1945, the world the Italian women had once known no longer existed. Mussolini was dead. Germany had collapsed, and the Allies stood triumphant. For months, rumors rippled through the camps. "We will be sent home soon." Yet when the day finally came, the news filled them with both relief and dread. The journey home began in reverse. The women boarded trains once again, watched the American countryside blur past, and felt a strange melancholy settle over them. Some wept quietly. They were leaving behind the order and security of captivity, 3 meals a day, warm beds, work that gave them purpose. Ahead lay uncertainty. The Atlantic crossing was different this time. They were no longer prisoners but repatriates. Still, the voyage was heavy with silence. At night, some whispered confessions. "I don't want to go back." Others admitted they had hidden away tokens, canteen scrip, a bar of soap, a Hershey wrapper. Little fragments of a world that had treated them with dignity when they expected only cruelty. When the ships reached Naples, the women stepped onto a shore that barely resembled their homeland. The docks were ruins, the air thick with the stench of sewage and smoke. Children with hollow eyes begged for scraps. Women in rags clutched thin babies. Buildings stood gutted streets, littered with rubble. It hit them immediately. They had lived better as captives than their families had as civilians. Some were reunited with relatives, their embraces filled with both joy and unease. "You look healthy," mothers whispered, eyes narrowing. "Too healthy." Others faced coldness. Neighbors muttered that POWs had been spoiled by the enemy, pampered while we starved. Even their own brothers looked at them with suspicion, as if time in an American camp had tainted their loyalty. The stigma was crushing. A few women tried to speak honestly, that the Americans had treated them with humanity, that they had been paid wages for their work, that they had been given food their families could only dream of. But the words died on their lips when they saw the disbelief, or worse, the bitterness on the faces before them. Impossible people spat. "The Americans are animals. They bombed our homes. They starved us." So the women kept silent. They carried their memories like a hidden wound. In drawers tucked between prayer books, they kept tokens of their captivity: camp currency, a dollar bill, the wrapper of a chocolate bar, smoothed flat and folded like a letter. Some never showed them to anyone, not even their children. These objects were both treasures and curses, reminders of survival, but also of the shame of having been fed, clothed, and paid by the enemy while their own people suffered. The irony haunted them. They had braced themselves for brutality but found mercy. They had expected to be slaves but were treated as workers, even rewarded with wages. Yet this very mercy became impossible to explain to those who had endured only hunger and bombs. Years later, some of the women admitted quietly in diaries or in whispers to grandchildren that captivity in America had been the most orderly, humane period of their lives. Not free, but safe. Not home, but strangely dignified. Yet even then they spoke of it with shame, as if kindness from the enemy was a stain they could not wash away. The war had ended, but the real prison remained. The silence they carried, the unspoken truth that the enemy had treated them not as animals but as human beings. For the Italian women who returned from American camps, release was not liberation. It was a heavier captivity, one of memory, guilt, and silence. War had promised them chains, but instead they were given blankets. They had braced for starvation, but instead they were served bread, bacon, and coffee. They had expected humiliation, yet were handed wages for their work, tokens of dignity in the most unlikely of places. For the Italian women who endured those years behind American barbed wire, the irony never faded. Their captors had fought with bombs and firepower, yes, but they had also fought with mercy, and it was this mercy, not cruelty, that proved most disarming. Food became more than sustenance. It became a weapon of soft power, a quiet force that eroded ideology more effectively than bullets. A chocolate bar could stir doubt, a paycheck could restore a sense of worth, a guard's simple kindness could unravel years of propaganda, yet for many these memories remained locked away. To speak of mercy in war was to invite suspicion, even condemnation, so they carried it silently, the knowledge that compassion had found them where they least expected it. And perhaps the most haunting truth is this: if mercy could exist, even in the darkest years of global conflict, what else might have been possible all along, if humanity had chosen kindness over hate?